All right, so we're 6 weeks into this war with Iran, and what was supposed to be a quick, decisive victory has instead become a really dangerous stalemate. Now, Donald Trump has just played what he hopes is his MasterCard. But the question is it a winning move or a catastrophic bluff? Let's break it down.
And really, the entire situation comes down to this one question. Trump has made this incredibly bold move to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. The idea is to cripple Iran's economy and force them to the negotiating table. But, well, all the evidence we're seeing suggests this plan could backfire spectacularly, and not just on the US, but on the entire world. So, what is this big MasterCard move anyway? Well, it's a full-scale blockade of one of the most critical waterways on the entire planet. Let's dig into what this actually means and why it is such a huge deal. To really get what's at stake here, you have to understand the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest, it is just a 50-kilometer choke point. But through that one tiny passage flows an incredible 20% of the world's entire oil and gas supply. It is, quite literally, the world's energy jugular. Now, Iran was already using this choke point as leverage, charging tolls to neutral ships just to let them pass. Trump called this financial terrorism. So his response? A double blockade. He's basically saying, oh, you want to restrict traffic? Fine, we'll just shut it down completely. And this quote right here, it just captures the whole logic of the move perfectly. It's raw, it's simple, and it's a total all-or-nothing gamble. No ships in, no ships out. The idea is to cut off Iran's economic lifeline, their oil exports, so completely that they have no choice but to surrender. On paper, it sounds pretty powerful. But the truth is, the strategy is deeply, deeply flawed, and it's already showing major signs of collapsing. So, let's get into why. And right here, you can see the massive gap between what they wanted to happen and what's actually happening. The goal was to corner Iran, force them into submission. But the likely reality? It's triggering a global supply shock that's going to hurt everyone, including, and maybe especially, the United States. See, the problem isn't just one thing. It's like a whole cascade of failures. The entire strategy is built on shaky ground. From underestimating how Iran can fight back in unconventional ways, to ignoring the simple logistical nightmare of trying to even enforce this thing. And this isn't some abstract economic theory we're talking about. The pain is already being felt right at home in the US. Fuel prices have already shot up by 30% in just 1 month. This blockade is just making a bad situation so much worse for the average American. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, China. A huge percentage of Iran's oil, we're talking somewhere between 80 and 90%, goes straight to them. So the real question is, did anyone really think a global superpower would just sit back and allow its energy supply to be cut off? And the answer is a big, resounding no. We're already seeing reports that a sanctioned Chinese tanker has basically called Trump's bluff and just sailed right through the blockade. This one move completely undermines the entire strategy, because if the US can't or won't stop China, the blockade is pretty much useless. The ripple effects of this are, of course, global. So let's shift our focus and take a look at the really severe consequences this blockade is having on a country like India. For the average Indian citizen, the impact is direct and it's painful. It's a simple but pretty brutal chain reaction. The blockade starts, the flow of that relatively cheap Iranian oil stops, the global supply gets squeezed, and bam, prices for everything from petrol to cooking gas cylinders go right through the roof. And what's really stark here is just how vulnerable India is. See, unlike China, which has diversified its supply chains, India relies on the Strait of Hormuz for over half of its fuel and LPG. When that one choke point closes, the country is in very serious trouble. And this phrase right here, it really says it all. We can't even make a squeak. It perfectly captures India's predicament. They're caught between their strategic partnership with the US and their absolutely critical energy needs. The country has very, very little room to maneuver. It's pretty much forced to go along with whatever Washington decides, even if it hurts its own people. Now, this is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because just 6 weeks ago, the conversation was all about regime change in Iran. Today, that conversation is shifting to regime change in the US and in Israel. Let's just look at the numbers. Donald Trump's approval rating has absolutely plummeted. It is now at -43%.
And that is a direct result of public frustration with a war he promised up and down he would not start.
And to put that number into perspective for you, Trump's approval rating is now lower than Richard Nixon's was in his final weeks before he was forced to resign. That is a historically unpopular position for a sitting president to be in.
So what's driving this incredibly unpopular war? Well, the analysis seems to point to personal politics. For Trump, it could be a cynical distraction from the Epstein scandal. And for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, it might just be a way to deflect from his own very serious corruption charges. And as all this pressure mounts, Trump's public statements have become more and more erratic. This quote is a perfect example. I mean, open the Hormuz trade, you crazy beasts. It's unpresidential, it's aggressive, and frankly, it's just bizarre. It's the kind of language that adds to a growing sense of instability. And look, it's not an isolated incident. From attacking the Pope, to threatening to wipe out an entire civilization, to even briefly tweeting and then deleting an image of himself as Jesus Christ. His behavior has fueled a really serious conversation in the US about his mental state, with some people even bringing up the 25th Amendment. And a recent poll shows that 61% of Americans now describe him as erratic. Which brings us right back to our final question. The goal was to destabilize the regime in Iran. But after 6 weeks of failed strategies and all this economic blowback, has this conflict actually ended up destabilizing the very leaders who started it? It really seems like the tables may have well and truly turned.